The grand crystal mansion of the Sterling family was completely illuminated by thousands of bright beeswax candles. It was May 1814, and the wealthy aristocracy of London had gathered to celebrate a highly extravagant royal wedding. Eleanor Vance stood entirely alone near the massive stone fountain in the center of the grand garden. She wore a dark moss green silk dress, and the faded color represented her strange position between deep mourning and forced survival. She was 26 years old, and she was the widow of the late Arthur Sterling. She was treated like a silent ghost by the glittering crowd. She was not tragic enough to receive their genuine pity, and she was certainly not wealthy enough to earn their polite respect. The loud music of the string quartet floated through the warm spring air, but Eleanor felt completely frozen in her quiet isolation. The beautiful ladies in their bright pink and soft blue gowns completely ignored her presence. The wealthy lords drank expensive champagne, and they turned their arrogant faces away when she looked in their general direction. Eleanor watched the happy bride twirl across the polished marble floor, and she felt a heavy weight settled deeply into her chest. She had once been a hopeful and radiant bride at the very tender age of 21, and she had foolishly believed in the sweet promises of romantic love. Her late husband Arthur had been charming and handsome, but his handsome face had hidden a terrible and destructive weakness. He had gambled away their entire fortune in dark and smoky card rooms, and he had left her with nothing but crushing debts and a shattered heart when he suddenly died. The sound of heavy footsteps crunched on the white gravel path behind her, and Eleanor tightened her grip on her delicate silk fan. Baron Silas Sterling stepped out of the dark shadows, and his thin face twisted into a cruel and mocking smile. Silas was the older cousin of her late husband, and he was a ruthless man who fed on the terrible misfortune of other vulnerable people. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from her, and his dark eyes swept over her faded green dress with obvious and deep disdain. He did not offer her a polite greeting or a respectful bow. He spoke with a voice that dripped with cold and calculated malice, and he reminded her that the massive debts of her dead husband were now her absolute responsibility. Silas told her quietly that she currently owed him exactly £3,000. He stated firmly that he had purchased all of Arthur's outstanding gambling notes from the dangerous creditors in London. Eleanor felt a sudden and freezing panic rush completely through her veins, but she kept her delicate chin held incredibly high. She knew perfectly well that Silas did not want the money, because he already possessed massive and vast wealth. He wanted the small and quiet country estate that she still legally owned. The modest manor was the absolute last piece of property she had left in the entire world, and it was her only safe sanctuary from the cruel judgment of high society. Silas leaned dangerously close to her pale face, and he demanded that she sign the legal transfer papers before the sun rose on the following morning. He threatened to completely ruin her delicate reputation, and he promised to throw her into the dark and miserable debtor's prison. If she completely refused his cruel demand, Eleanor tried to carefully regulate her suddenly fast breathing, and she desperately searched her brilliant mind for a safe escape route. She was completely cornered by the ruthless Baron, and she had absolutely no powerful allies in the entire grand ballroom to successfully protect her. She opened her mouth to deliver a sharp and defiant refusal, but another deep and incredibly resonant voice completely shattered the heavy tension in the quiet garden. The deep voice was cold and sharp like a blade of pure ice, and it commanded Silas to step away from the lady immediately. Eleanor turned her head quickly and her breath caught sharply in her throat, Julian Sinclair stepped into the soft, yellow light of the hanging lanterns, and his tall and imposing figure completely dominated the entire garden. He was the immensely powerful Duke of Winterbourne, and he was known throughout the British Empire as the terrifying fortress of ice. He possessed vast lands and endless wealth, but he was mostly feared for his completely ruthless and highly calculating nature. He wore a perfectly tailored coat of midnight black velvet, and his striking silver eyes locked directly onto the pale face of the terrified Baron. Silas took a clumsy step backward, and his cruel arrogance instantly evaporated under the freezing and heavy glare of the powerful Duke. Julian did not raise his deep voice, but his absolute authority radiated from every single line of his rigid and handsome face. He told the trembling Baron that he could clearly smell the terrible stench of rotting greed pouring from his pathetic soul. He stated coldly that he was personally taking over the financial affairs of Lady Eleanor Vance. He commanded Silas to completely disappear from his sight before he decided to ruin the Baron's entire miserable life. Silas opened his mouth to protest the sudden and massive interference, but one dark and threatening look from the Duke silenced him completely. The cowardly Baron bowed hastily, and he practically ran away into the dark shadows of the sprawling estate. Eleanor stood perfectly still, and she stared at the imposing Duke with wide and incredibly shocked eyes. She had never been officially introduced to Julian Sinclair, and she had absolutely no idea why the most powerful man in London had just saved her from total ruin. Julian turned his intense silver gaze toward her, and he studied her beautiful and proud face with a highly analytical and quiet interest. He stepped closer to the stone fountain, and the cool night air seemed to crackle with a sudden and highly dangerous electricity. He did not offer her empty words of polite comfort, and he did not look at her with the sickening pity she always saw in the eyes of other wealthy people. He told her plainly that the massive debt of £3,000 was currently suffocating her necessary and vital freedom. He stated calmly that he was entirely willing to clear the terrible financial burden completely. Eleanor felt her sharp intellect quickly engage, and she immediately suspected a hidden and dangerous trap. She asked him politely what exact and terrible price she would have to pay for such massive and sudden generosity. Julian offered her a very small and highly dangerous smile that did not reach the cold depths of his silver eyes. He replied smoothly that they simply needed to establish a highly beneficial and mutual covenant. He explained his difficult and highly frustrating situation with absolute and brutal honesty. His imposing and highly manipulative mother, the Dowager Duchess Agatha, was currently attempting to completely force him into a ridiculous and unwanted political marriage. She had deliberately invited 5 highly ambitious and completely ruthless young ladies to the Grand Winterbourne Castle for the entire summer season. Julian stated firmly that he desperately needed a strong and unbreakable shield to successfully survive the terrible romantic siege. He needed a convincing and entirely fake fiancée to completely ruin the grand matchmaking schemes of his demanding mother. He proposed a formal and strictly business arrangement. He asked Eleanor to travel to Winterbourne Castle, and he asked her to successfully pretend to be his chosen bride for exactly 3 long months. He promised to pay her massive debts immediately, and he offered her an additional settlement of £20,000 when they eventually ended the fake engagement in the cool autumn months. He stated clearly that the massive sum of money would successfully guarantee her absolute and permanent independence for the rest of her long life. Eleanor listened to his shocking and highly scandalous proposal with a completely racing heart. £20,000 was a staggering and truly massive fortune, and it represented the beautiful and ultimate freedom she had always desperately craved. She looked deeply into his intense and waiting silver eyes, and she searched for any sign of cruel deception. She only saw a deeply tired and highly cautious man who was desperately trying to successfully protect his own lonely sanctuary. She knew perfectly well that the wealthy aristocracy would completely tear her delicate reputation to shreds. When the fake engagement was eventually broken, she warned the Duke quietly that she was a poor and socially ruined widow. She told him that the cruel high society would firmly believe she had maliciously trapped him for his massive wealth. Julian stepped slightly closer, and he completely dismissed her valid fears with a simple and highly confident wave of his strong hand. He told her firmly that he did not care about the foolish opinions of the shallow and empty aristocracy. He stated deeply that he only cared about securing his own peaceful and quiet future. He asked her gently if she possessed the necessary courage to bravely step into his dangerous and cold world. Eleanor thought about the terrible and dark alternative of the debtor's prison, and she thought about the highly cruel and victorious smile of Silas Sterling. She took a very deep and completely steadying breath, and she lifted her chin with true and absolute pride. She told the powerful Duke of Winterbourne that she fully accepted his highly dangerous and magnificent covenant. Julian let out a soft and highly relieved sigh, and the thick tension in his broad shoulders completely vanished. He reached out his large and warm hand, and he gently grasped her cold and trembling fingers. He told her quietly that they needed to officially seal their new and secret bargain with a highly public and truly shocking declaration. He led her firmly away from the quiet shadows of the stone fountain, and they walked steadily toward the bright and incredibly crowded ballroom. The loud music continued to play, and the wealthy guests continued to laugh and dance in their completely oblivious and happy bubbles. Julian pulled Eleanor directly into the exact center of the highly polished marble floor, and the surrounding dancers quickly stopped moving in absolute and total shock. The loud music faded into a messy and confusing silence as every single pair of judging eyes turned to stare at the completely unprecedented and highly scandalous sight. The terrifying fortress of ice was firmly holding the delicate hand of the ruined and poor widow. Julian completely ignored the loud and dramatic gasps of the wealthy ladies, and he completely ignored the shocked and angry expression on the cold face of his powerful mother. He raised Eleanor's hand gracefully to his firm lips, and he announced loudly and clearly to the entire frozen assembly that the beautiful Lady Eleanor Vance had just done him the absolute and profound honor of accepting his hand in marriage. The magnificent and highly dangerous covenant was finally sealed, and the grand and epic battle for their true freedom had officially begun. The grand and completely magnificent carriage of the powerful Duke of Winterbourne traveled swiftly and steadily along the highly dusty and winding northern roads. It was early June 1814, and the warm summer breeze blew softly and gently through the open glass windows of the dark velvet interior. Eleanor Vance sat quietly and rigidly on the plush leather seat, and her highly intelligent dark eyes carefully studied the incredibly handsome man sitting directly across from her. Julian Sinclair, who was widely known and deeply feared as the terrifying fortress of ice, watched the passing green and lush hills with a completely unreadable and absolutely cold expression. They had officially departed from the busy and crowded streets of London, at exactly 8 hours 00 minutes. That beautiful morning, the heavy and highly oppressive silence between them was incredibly thick and deeply uncomfortable for her cautious heart. Eleanor finally took a very deep and steadying breath, and she bravely decided to completely break the quiet and tense atmosphere. She spoke with a clear voice that was perfectly steady and highly melodic. She politely asked the powerful Duke what exact rules and strict boundaries they desperately needed to establish for their dangerous and fake covenant. Julian turned his striking and intense silver gaze away from the clear glass window, and he looked directly into her calm and beautiful face. He told her quietly that the massive and ancient stone walls of Winterbourne Castle were currently filled completely with dangerous enemies and sharp aristocratic spies. He stated firmly and with absolute certainty that his highly controlling and deeply manipulative mother, the Dowager Duchess Agatha, would watch their every single move with absolute and ruthless scrutiny. He warned her sincerely that the older woman possessed a truly brilliant and highly destructive mind. He carefully explained his complex and highly strategic plan with cold and pure logic. He said calmly that whenever they were physically standing in the grand and public rooms of the massive estate, they absolutely must appear as a deeply passionate and entirely devoted romantic couple. He strictly required her to hold his strong and muscular arm, and he required her to smile warmly and affectionately at his spoken words. He stated clearly that in the quiet and absolute privacy of their own separate and secure bedchambers, they would always maintain strict professional distance and absolute mutual respect. Eleanor listened carefully and attentively to his rigid and highly practical demands, and she nodded her elegant head in quiet and complete agreement. She suddenly felt a sharp and heavy wave of deep anxiety flutter rapidly in her stomach. She told him honestly and without any foolish hesitation that she was absolutely not a skilled or trained actress. She stated quietly that she did not know how to successfully perform the foolish and highly giggling role of a young woman who was completely blinded by silly and shallow romantic love. Julian offered her a very small and surprisingly warm smile that slightly and beautifully softened the harsh and rigid lines of his incredibly handsome face. He leaned slightly forward in the swaying carriage, and he rested his broad and highly tense shoulders against the soft velvet cushions. He told her firmly that she absolutely must not pretend to be a foolish or silly debutante. He confessed quietly that he deeply and truly despised the empty-headed and completely shallow ladies of the London ton. He instructed her cleverly and with profound respect to simply use her natural and highly brilliant intellect as her primary and ultimate weapon. He said deeply that a grand love built strictly upon deep intellectual respect and sharp verbal debate was the absolute best and most flawless disguise they could possibly use. He told her sincerely that her genuine and highly observant nature would easily confuse and completely baffle the shallow and arrogant women currently waiting at the grand and ancient castle. Eleanor felt a strong and completely unexpected surge of true confidence completely replace her terrible and heavy anxiety. She realized perfectly in that exact moment that the terrifying fortress of ice was actively treating her as a highly capable and entirely equal partner in this massive and dangerous deception. The magnificent and highly towering spires of Winterbourne Castle finally appeared darkly against the fading evening sky at exactly 19 hours 30 minutes. The ancient and massive stone fortress was incredibly large and highly intimidating, and it looked exactly like a dark and sleeping dragon resting heavily upon the high and green hills. The dark carriage rolled smoothly and quietly through the huge and imposing iron gates, and it stopped directly before the grand and ancient entrance of the main keep. Julian stepped out quickly and gracefully, and he offered his large and warm hand to safely help Eleanor descend from the dark and enclosed carriage. She placed her cold and trembling fingers securely in his strong and highly comforting grip, and she prepared herself bravely for the incoming and terrible social battle. The grand and cavernous entrance hall was completely and brilliantly illuminated by hundreds of bright and flickering beeswax candles. The Dowager Duchess Agatha stood proudly and rigidly at the very bottom of the wide and polished marble staircase, and she looked exactly like a cold and completely unforgiving statue of pure aristocratic authority. 5 beautifully dressed and highly ambitious young ladies stood closely and nervously behind the powerful and older woman. They were the elegant and dangerous wolf pack, carefully and specifically selected to completely secure the massive Winterbourne fortune. Lady Victoria wore a stunning and highly expensive gown of bright crimson silk, and her sharp and calculating blue eyes glared directly at Eleanor with immediate and absolute hatred. Lady Beatrice stood quietly and observantly beside Victoria, and the highly calculating woman analyzed Eleanor's simple and faded traveling dress with a highly dismissive and completely cruel sneer. Julian did not release Eleanor's delicate and small hand for a single moment. He led her directly and confidently toward his completely rigid and highly furious mother. He bowed with perfect and completely cold formal grace, and he proudly and loudly introduced Lady Eleanor Vance as his chosen and completely beloved future bride. The Dowager Duchess did not offer a single and polite word of basic welcome. She simply stared at the poor and completely ruined widow with completely naked and highly burning disdain. The 5 aristocratic and wealthy ladies whispered maliciously and loudly behind their painted and delicate silk fans, and the heavy atmosphere in the grand hall became instantly toxic and highly suffocating. Julian completely and utterly ignored their terrible and highly rude behavior, and he firmly and protectively escorted Eleanor toward the grand dining room for the highly anticipated evening meal. The massive and long dining table was completely covered with expensive and shining silver plates and rare crystal glasses. The long and highly tense dinner felt exactly like a brutal and highly calculated criminal interrogation. Lady Victoria sat directly across the wide table from Eleanor, and the cruel and highly ambitious lady decided to aggressively launch the very first and vicious verbal attack. Victoria asked loudly and with fake sweetness if it was terribly and horribly difficult for Eleanor to safely adjust to such grand and massive luxury after living in absolute and miserable poverty following the terrible death of her highly ruined husband. The other 4 wealthy ladies giggled softly and cruelly at the completely insulting and highly direct question. They fully and eagerly expected the poor and broken widow to completely break down in heavy tears or to lower her elegant head in deep and burning shame. Eleanor absolutely did not cry, and she completely refused to retreat from the hostile and highly cruel social challenge. She placed her heavy silver fork gently and quietly onto the white and flawless porcelain plate, and she looked directly and fearlessly into Victoria's sharp and highly mocking blue eyes. She replied with a beautiful voice that was completely smooth and incredibly calm. She told the arrogant and foolish lady that surviving the harsh and terrible realities of profound financial ruin required immense inner strength and highly practical intelligence. She stated firmly and with absolute conviction that empty and massive luxury was completely and utterly useless without the proper and deep knowledge to successfully maintain the vast and working agricultural estate Lady Beatrice quickly and eagerly joined the vicious and highly toxic verbal battle. The calculating and highly observant woman smirked darkly and maliciously, and she stated proudly that a true and proper duchess only truly needed to know how to properly arrange blooming spring flowers and play the grand and expensive pianoforte. Eleanor turned her highly intelligent and dark gaze directly toward the smug face of Beatrice, and she delivered a brilliant and highly devastating intellectual counterattack. Eleanor explained complex and highly advanced agricultural theories with absolute and flawless precision. She discussed the vital and absolutely necessary importance of modern crop rotation to safely preserve the rich soil. She discussed the proper and highly ethical management of the vulnerable tenant farmers. And she discussed the highly necessary and highly dangerous maintenance of the extremely profitable northern coal mines. She completely and utterly dismantled their shallow and foolish arguments with pure and undeniable economic logic. She stated proudly and with fierce inner passion that a grand and ancient aristocratic title was absolutely nothing but a completely empty word if the wealthy, noble family completely neglected the hardworking and vulnerable people living on their vast and highly profitable lands. The 5 aristocratic and highly arrogant ladies sat in absolute and completely stunned silence. They possessed absolutely no practical or useful knowledge of complex estate management, and they could not possibly or successfully argue against her brilliant and flawless economic facts. The Dowager Duchess Agatha narrowed her old and sharp eyes, and the powerful and highly intelligent woman realized suddenly and completely that this supposedly poor and broken widow was a highly dangerous and incredibly formidable opponent. Julian had watched the entire brilliant and highly fiery exchange with silent and profound admiration. His striking and intense silver eyes burned brightly with a hidden and highly warm fire. He completely abandoned his cold and barely touched a plate of expensive food, and he leaned powerfully toward the exact center of the massive and silent table. He looked directly and fearlessly at his highly furious mother and the completely defeated and silent ladies. He spoke with an incredibly deep voice that echoed heavily with absolute and highly terrifying authority. He declared boldly and proudly to the entire shocked room that he sought a true and highly brilliant queen to successfully and fairly rule his vast and ancient territory. He stated firmly and with final absolute certainty that he absolutely did not want a foolish and completely empty canary to simply decorate a golden and completely useless cage. His powerful and truly magnificent words hung heavily and beautifully in the quiet and tense air of the grand dining room. Eleanor felt her rapidly racing heart flutter wildly and happily inside her tense chest. The dangerous and highly secret covenant was supposedly designed to be a completely fake and strictly professional business arrangement, but the intense and deeply burning look in Julian's striking silver eyes felt incredibly real and completely overwhelming to her completely guarded soul. The brutal and highly toxic dinner had completely and utterly failed to break her strong and independent spirit. She had successfully and brilliantly proven her true and absolute worth to the terrifying fortress of ice. The massive and ancient stone walls of Winterbourne Castle had finally witnessed the glorious and highly triumphant arrival of their brilliant future mistress, and the epic and highly emotional war for the dark and incredibly lonely soul of the powerful Duke had truly and beautifully begun in absolute earnest. The early morning mist hung heavily over the dark and ancient pine forests of the Winterbourne estate. It was mid-June 1814, and the sprawling and massive grounds were completely silent and highly peaceful. Eleanor Vance woke long before the bright and golden sun fully rose above the eastern horizon. She dressed quickly and quietly in a dark blue velvet riding habit, and she made her way silently down the massive and sweeping stone staircase. She desperately needed to completely escape the suffocating and highly toxic presence of the Dowager Duchess Agatha, and she urgently needed to avoid the 5 highly ambitious and cruel aristocratic ladies. She walked gracefully toward the grand and sprawling royal stables, and she found Julian Sinclair already waiting patiently for her arrival. The powerful and terrifying Duke of Winterbourne sat perfectly and gracefully atop a massive and powerful black stallion. He held the thick leather reins of a beautiful and gentle white mare, and he offered the magnificent horse to his fake and brilliant fiancée. They rode together in absolute and highly peaceful silence away from the grand and imposing stone castle. The thick and green canopy of the ancient pine trees completely blocked the bright and rising morning sun, and it cast long and beautiful shadows across the winding dirt path. They were entirely and completely free from the cruel and highly judging eyes of the wealthy aristocratic society. Eleanor felt a profound and massive sense of pure and absolute freedom completely wash over her tired and heavily burdened soul. Julian rode very close beside her, and his striking and intense silver eyes carefully watched the rugged and uneven forest trail. He did not wear the heavy and rigid and freezing mask of the terrifying fortress of ice in the quiet woods. He simply looked like a deeply tired and profoundly lonely man who carried the massive and crushing weight of the entire British Empire on his broad and muscular shoulders. They rode steadily and quietly for exactly 1 hour 00 minutes, and they finally reached a high and rocky cliff. They stopped their strong and panting horses to quietly admire the breathtaking and endless view of the vast and lush green valley below them. Eleanor looked down at the sprawling and beautiful lands, and she took a very deep and completely steadying breath of the crisp and cold morning air. She decided bravely and with absolute resolve to completely strip away her own thick and heavy protective armor. She spoke quietly and honestly to the silent and listening Duke, and she told him the painful and bitter truth about the terrible and crushing mistakes of her dark past. She explained with a soft and trembling voice that she had been only 21 years old when she foolishly and blindly married Arthur Sterling. She said deeply and with absolute regret that Arthur had possessed a charming and handsome smile, but he harbored a completely rotten and highly destructive core. He had spent every single and lonely night in dark and smoky and dangerous gambling halls in the busy city of London. He had slowly and selfishly destroyed their entire and massive fortune, and he had cowardly left her to face the vicious and ruthless creditors entirely alone when he suddenly and tragically died. She confessed quietly and with deep sorrow that she carried a heavy and highly bitter guilt inside her chest. She blamed her own knave and foolish and trusting heart for willingly choosing such a weak and deeply flawed and terrible man. Julian listened to her painful and completely honest words with deep and profound and absolute respect. He did not offer her any empty or shallow or highly insulting pity. He smoothly and gracefully dismounted his massive and dark horse, and he gently helped Eleanor step down safely onto the soft and wet green grass. He stood very close to her delicate figure, and he looked directly and fearlessly into her dark and highly intelligent eyes. He told her sincerely and with a remarkably gentle tone that she was absolutely and entirely not the only person in the cruel world who had been completely and utterly destroyed by blind and foolish and misplaced trust. He decided bravely and with immense inner strength to completely reveal the dark and highly guarded and bloody secret of his own frozen and dead heart. He spoke with a deep and resonant voice that was incredibly thick with old and heavy and agonizing pain. He explained slowly and carefully that exactly 5 years ago he had been happily and completely engaged to a beautiful and highly elegant woman named Genevieve. He had loved her deeply and completely with his entire and trusting soul, and he had believed in her sweet and romantic promises entirely. But on the very cold and dark night, directly before their grand and highly anticipated royal wedding, Genevieve had suddenly and cruelly and completely vanished from the massive estate. She had completely and maliciously abandoned him without a single word of kind explanation, and she had selfishly run away with his own younger and highly trusted brother Edward Sinclair. Julian stated bitterly and with completely raw and unfiltered agony that the sudden and double betrayal had completely and permanently shattered his entire and perfect world. The two specific and highly cherished people he had loved and trusted the most in the entire vast British Empire had maliciously and cruelly stabbed him directly and deeply in the back. He told Eleanor with a cold and freezing tone that he had forcefully and permanently locked his broken and bleeding heart away in a deep and dark and completely freezing vault. He had deliberately and highly strategically transformed himself into the terrifying and unfeeling fortress of ice to successfully and absolutely ensure that absolutely no one could ever betray or hurt him again. He looked away from her pale face and stared at the vast and empty valley, and he said firmly and with absolute dark conviction that he completely and truly viewed romantic and passionate love as a highly dangerous and deadly and foolish disease. Eleanor listened to his tragic and completely heartbreaking and devastating story, and she felt a hot and salty tear slide slowly and quietly down her pale and soft cheek. She understood his profound and absolute and paralyzing agony perfectly and completely. She stepped much closer to his tall and imposing and rigid figure, and she spoke with fierce and undeniable and highly passionate conviction. She told him softly and with immense and absolute courage that he only built his massive and terrifying authority simply to hide his deep and terrible and paralyzing fear of being completely abandoned and ruined again. She stated firmly and with brilliant and sharp insight that a heart that absolutely and completely dare not bleed is a heart that is already completely and utterly and tragically dead. Julian stood perfectly and absolutely still in the cool morning breeze, and her sharp and brilliant and completely truthful words struck him heavily and painfully like a massive and solid physical blow. He looked down at her beautiful and fiercely determined and highly intelligent face, and he felt the thick and ancient and freezing ice around his soul begin to loudly and violently crack. He replied with a low and incredibly deep voice that trembled slightly and beautifully with completely raw and highly suppressed emotion. He told the ruined and brilliant widow that perhaps she was the absolute and entirely only person in the entire cruel and vast world who was truly and completely brave enough to take a sharp and heavy knife and completely and surgically dissect his dead and frozen and completely ruined heart. The profound and heavy and incredibly beautiful silence stretched warmly and perfectly between them in the quiet and ancient forest. They were two highly broken and deeply damaged and thoroughly betrayed souls standing completely together and entirely alone on the high and windy and green cliff. The completely fake and strictly professional and highly business-oriented covenant was slowly and surely and completely transforming into something incredibly real and highly dangerous and profoundly beautiful. They had successfully and bravely bared their deepest and darkest and most bloody wounds to each other, and they had found true and absolute and perfect understanding in their shared and highly bitter pain, Julian gently and slowly reached out his large and warm and heavily calloused hand, and he carefully and tenderly wiped the single and wet tear from her soft and beautiful cheek. The simple and highly intimate and profoundly quiet gesture carried significantly more genuine and true and absolute affection than 1,000 empty and foolish and shallow romantic promises. They eventually and quietly mounted their strong and rested horses again, and they rode slowly and peacefully back toward the massive and imposing stone fortress of Winterbourne. The highly dangerous and deeply toxic and completely malicious aristocratic ladies were still waiting eagerly and cruelly for them at the grand and massive castle, but Julian and Eleanor were absolutely and entirely no longer facing the cruel and vicious social war completely alone. They had successfully and beautifully forged a true and unbreakable and highly profound bond in the quiet and peaceful and ancient pine forest, and the thick and freezing and ancient ice surrounding Lonely Duke was found in the powerful and lonely Duke was finally and completely and truly completely imbuing and beautifully melt under the warm and brilliant light of her sharp and highly observant mind. The magnificent summer ball at Winterbourne Castle officially commenced at exactly 20 hours 00 minutes in the middle of July 1814. Thousands of expensive beeswax candles burned brightly inside the massive crystal chandeliers, and they cast a warm and golden glow over the wealthy aristocrats of London. Eleanor Vance stood gracefully near the tall glass windows, and she wore a breathtaking gown of deep midnight blue silk. She looked like a true and elegant queen of the dark night. Julian Sinclair, who was the incredibly powerful Duke of Winterbourne, stood closely beside his striking silver eyes. The Sir carefully watched the swirling crowd of dancers. The fake and strictly professional covenant between them had slowly blossomed into something deeply profound and beautifully real during the past few weeks. But the highly dangerous aristocratic society was still actively plotting their complete and absolute downfall. The Dowager Duchess Agatha sat upon a carved wooden chair at the far end of the grand ballroom, and she held a delicate lace fan against her aged face. The cruel and highly manipulative mother had secretly orchestrated a terrible and vicious surprise for the festive evening. The grand double doors of the ballroom suddenly swung open, and the loud string music briefly paused. Lady Genevieve slowly walked into the crowded and bright room, and the gathered nobles gasped quietly at her highly unexpected arrival. Genevieve was the former and highly beloved fiancée of the Duke, and she was the exact woman who had maliciously broken his trusting heart 5 years ago. She was currently a grieving and pale widow because the younger brother, Edward Sinclair, had recently died from sudden and terrible fever. Genevieve wore a gown of pale silver silk. She wore delicate pearl gloves, and she wore an expression of profound and tragic sorrow. Julian went completely and absolutely rigid beside Eleanor, and his broad and muscular shoulders tensed with sudden and overwhelming agony. The terrible ghosts of his dark and painful past were suddenly standing directly before him in the brightly lit room. Eleanor felt the massive and freezing tension radiating from his tall and imposing body, and she gently tightened her soft grip on his strong arm. She did not speak any foolish or empty words of comfort, but she offered him her silent and unwavering strength. Julian looked down at her beautiful and calm face, and the ancient and thick ice around his deeply scarred heart slowly began to thaw once again. He completely ignored the pathetic and weeping presence of his former lover, and he proudly led Eleanor directly onto the crowded and polished dance floor to perform the opening waltz. However, while the wealthy guests were completely distracted by the dramatic and highly tense romantic reunion downstairs, a truly dark and vicious plot was actively unfolding in the quiet and empty upper corridors of the massive stone castle. Lady Victoria and Lady Beatrice, who were the most cruel and highly ambitious members of the invited aristocratic ladies, had secretly and maliciously smuggled Baron Silas Sterling directly into the highly secure estate. Silas was the evil and ruthless cousin of Eleanor's late husband, and he possessed a truly rotten and greedy soul. The ladies had quietly unlocked the heavy wooden door to Eleanor's private bedchamber, and they had allowed the wicked Baron to sneak inside the dark and empty room. Silas walked across the soft Persian carpets, and he placed a highly convincing and completely forged letter directly onto her pristine mahogany writing desk. The fake and malicious letter was supposedly written by her dead husband Arthur, and it falsely claimed that Eleanor was actively planning to steal massive fortunes from the wealthy Sinclair family to secretly pay her old and hidden gambling debts. Silas then reached deeply into his dark velvet coat, and he pulled out the ancient and absolutely priceless Sinclair jade pendant. The heavy and brilliantly green jewel was a sacred and highly guarded family heirloom that the wicked ladies had secretly stolen from the private vault of the Dowager Duchess. Silas hid the precious and beautiful necklace carefully beneath the soft and white silk pillows of Eleanor's large bed. The vicious and highly coordinated enemies fully intended to publicly frame the poor and innocent widow for terrible theft and malicious scheming before the grand ball ended. Downstairs in the bright and noisy ballroom, the lively music continued to play beautifully for the dancing guests. Eleanor felt slightly overwhelmed by the heavy heat and the loud chatter of the massive crowd, and she politely excused herself from the side of the protective Duke to simply catch her breath. She walked gracefully out through the tall glass doors, and she stepped onto the cool and dark stone terrace overlooking the vast and green estate gardens. She closed her dark and intelligent eyes for a brief and quiet moment, and she enjoyed the soft and gentle summer breeze blowing against her warm cheeks. Suddenly, the loud and highly obnoxious sound of heavy boots echoed harshly against the stone floor. Baron Silas Sterling stepped out of the dark and concealing shadows of the tall rose bushes, and his thin and cruel face was twisted into a highly victorious and malicious sneer. Eleanor quickly opened her eyes, and her steady heart immediately began to race with sudden and freezing panic. She absolutely did not understand how the ruthless and dangerous man had successfully bypassed the strict and heavy security of the grand castle. Silas stepped aggressively and dangerously close to her delicate figure, and he laughed with a cold and truly terrifying sound. He spoke loudly and deliberately, so that the nearby wealthy aristocrats standing near the open glass doors could clearly hear his vicious and cruel accusations. He called her a pathetic and desperate fortune hunter, and he loudly accused her of maliciously bewitching the powerful Duke of Winterbourne to simply steal his endless and massive wealth. He shouted angrily into the quiet night air that she was a filthy and lying thief who entirely belonged in the dark and miserable debtor's prison. The wealthy and highly curious nobles quickly gathered near the edge of the stone terrace, and they eagerly watched the terrible and highly public humiliation of the beautiful future bride. Eleanor stood perfectly tall and incredibly proud, and she completely refused to cower or weep before the wicked and truly evil Baron. She opened her mouth to deliver a sharp and brilliant intellectual defense, but she was completely interrupted by the sudden and highly terrifying arrival of absolute and pure aristocratic fury. Julian Sinclair marched onto the dark stone terrace, and he looked exactly like a terrifying and heavily armed god of war descending from the stormy heavens. His striking and intense silver eyes burned with a blinding and absolutely deadly fire, and his handsome face was set into a mask of pure and completely unyielding rage. He had heard the loud and vicious commotion from the crowded dance floor, and he had completely abandoned all strict rules of polite and formal aristocratic society. He crossed the wide stone space in 3 massive and rapid strides, and he violently grabbed Silas by the expensive velvet collar of his dark coat. The powerful Duke of Winterbourne lifted the pathetic and trembling Baron completely off his leather boots, and he slammed him forcefully and heavily against the hard and cold stone wall of the ancient castle. The gathered and wealthy nobles gasped loudly in absolute and complete shock, and they nervously stepped backward to entirely avoid the explosive and deadly wrath of the terrifying fortress of ice. Julian did not care about the judging and wide eyes of his wealthy peers, and he did not care about the highly scandalous and terrible rumors that would surely follow his violent and brutal actions. He only cared about safely and completely protecting the brilliant and beautiful woman he deeply and truly loved. He spoke to the terrified and choking Baron with a voice that was completely freezing and absolutely deadly, and the deep sound echoed threateningly across the quiet and dark gardens. He commanded Silas to completely and permanently vanish from his sight, and he ordered him to never step foot on Sinclair lands ever again. He swore with absolute and fierce conviction that he would completely and utterly crush the entire Sterling estate into fine and worthless dust if Silas ever dared to even look at Lady Eleanor Vance again. He promised to legally and financially ruin the Baron's entire miserable and greedy existence, and he stated firmly that he possessed the massive wealth and the high royal authority to successfully execute his terrible and dark threat. Julian forcefully threw the cowardly and shaking Baron onto the hard stone floor, and he signaled for his highly trained and heavily armed estate guards to immediately drag the unwanted intruder out of the grand and secure castle. Silas scrambled desperately and pathetically to his feet, and he practically ran crying into the dark and empty night. To completely escape the terrifying and completely blinding wrath of the powerful Duke, Julian turned his tall and imposing body away from the fleeing enemy, and he immediately focused his entire and absolute attention on the quiet and pale widow standing near the glass doors. He reached out his large and warm hands, and he gently and tenderly framed her beautiful and highly intelligent face. He asked her softly and with deep and profound concern if the cruel and wicked man had physically harmed her delicate and precious figure. Eleanor shook her head slowly and quietly, and she leaned her warm cheek into the highly comforting and completely safe palm of his strong hand. The completely fake and strictly business-oriented covenant was absolutely and entirely forgotten in that highly emotional and dramatic moment. Julian wrapped his muscular and broad arms securely around her waist, and he pulled her closely and protectively against his heavily beating chest. The brilliant and strong shipping heiress and the powerful and terrifying Duke stood completely united and entirely unbothered on the dark stone terrace, while the massive and highly dangerous storm of aristocratic scandal slowly and inevitably gathered above their brave and throated heads. The heavy wood in the private bedchamber swung wooden door of the private bedchamber swung open quietly at his 40 hour. Exactly 40 here. Julian Sinclair, who was the incredibly powerful Duke of Winterbourne, escorted Lady Eleanor Vance safely back to her silent room. The grand and bright summer ball continued loudly downstairs, But the heavy and tense atmosphere between the two quiet figures was incredibly thick. Eleanor walked gracefully across the soft Persian carpet, and her beautiful face was pale from the terrible and violent confrontation on the dark stone terrace. She felt incredibly exhausted by the endless and cruel aristocratic warfare. Julian closed the thick door firmly behind them, and his striking silver eyes swept carefully across the large and quiet space. He noticed the terrible and malicious trap almost immediately. The heavy mahogany writing desk was completely covered with scattered and messy white papers. Eleanor gasped softly, and she stepped quickly toward the beautiful wooden furniture. A single and crisp piece of parchment rested directly in the exact center of the ruined desk. It was the completely fake and highly malicious letter that Baron Silas Sterling had secretly and wickedly planted. Julian picked up the terrible and forged document, and his strong hands gripped the thin paper tightly. His handsome face turned into a rigid and terrifying mask of pure and absolute fury as he quickly read the highly cruel and completely false accusations. The wicked letter falsely claimed that Eleanor was actively and maliciously plotting to completely drain the massive Sinclair fortune. Eleanor felt her rapidly racing heart drop heavily into her stomach, and she feared that the powerful Duke would finally and completely believe the terrible lies. She opened her mouth to eagerly and desperately defend her innocent honor, but Julian completely raised his strong hand to gently stop her frantic words. He did not look at her with cold or freezing suspicion. He looked at her with absolute and completely unwavering trust. He walked directly toward the grand and burning stone fireplace, and he threw the highly malicious and forged letter straight into the bright and consuming orange flames. They watched the terrible and fake words turn completely into dark and floating ash. Julian turned his tall and imposing body away from the warm fire, and his sharp silver eyes noticed another highly unusual detail near the large bed. He walked purposefully toward the soft and white silk pillows, and he reached his strong hand beneath the delicate and expensive fabric. He pulled out the ancient and absolutely priceless Sinclair jade pendant. The heavy and brilliantly green jewel sparkled brightly in the soft candlelight. Eleanor stared at the grand and royal heirloom with wide and completely shocked eyes. She realized instantly that the cruel and ambitious ladies had maliciously hidden the precious necklace to completely and utterly frame her for terrible and shameful theft. Julian stared at the massive and heavy green jewel resting in his broad palm. The ancient and royal pendant was worth a massive and truly staggering fortune, but the powerful Duke felt absolutely nothing but pure and completely burning rage toward the lifeless object. He realized perfectly that his highly cruel and manipulative enemies were using his own family history to actively and viciously attack the brilliant woman he deeply loved. He raised his strong right arm high into the warm air, and he threw the ancient and priceless Sinclair jade pendant violently against the hard and solid stone hearth. The heavy green jewel completely shattered into 100 small and sharp pieces, and the loud and terrible sound echoed sharply throughout the quiet and empty room. Eleanor gasped loudly at the completely shocking and highly destructive action. She asked him quietly and with trembling breath why he had completely destroyed such a rare and magnificent historical treasure. Julian stepped incredibly close to her delicate figure, and his intense silver eyes burned with a fierce and completely overwhelming protective fire. He told her deeply and firmly that absolutely no piece of cold stone or ancient metal was worth her precious and beautiful tears. He stated with absolute and highly commanding authority that he would gladly and completely burn the entire and massive winterborn castle to the ground if it meant keeping her completely and absolutely safe from the cruel and wicked world. He reached out his large and warm hands, and he firmly grasped her slender shoulders. He spoke with a voice that was completely thick with heavy and desperate emotion. He told her clearly that the fake and highly professional covenant was completely and entirely finished. He declared boldly and proudly that he absolutely could not allow her to ever face the terrible and vicious aristocracy alone. He proposed a completely real and permanent and lifelong marriage. You're right there in the quiet and ruined bedchamber. He offered her his massive wealth. He offered her his ancient title. And he offered her his absolute and complete protection. He promised to be her strong and permanent shield against every single enemy she would ever encounter. Elinor listened to his passionate and highly intense proposal, and her steady heart suddenly ached with a profound and truly agonizing sorrow. She looked deeply into his striking and beautiful silver eyes, and she saw the massive and terrifying fear completely hidden beneath his protective and angry words. He was actively offering her a grand and highly secure golden cage, but he was completely and cowardly hiding his true and vulnerable heart. She gently and slowly removed his strong hands from her delicate shoulders, and she took a very small and highly painful step backward. She spoke with a beautiful voice that was incredibly clear and completely unwavering. She told him quietly and with absolute honesty that she had once foolishly married a handsome man who offered her highly empty and shallow promises. She stated firmly that she had barely survived the terrible and dark ruins of her first disastrous marriage. She told the powerful and listening Duke that she absolutely refused to marry simply to become a safe and protected treasure in his massive and cold fortress. She explained deeply that true and real marriage required absolute and complete vulnerability. She looked directly at his rigid and handsome face, and she delivered her final and completely devastating truth. She told him bravely that he was proposing completely out of deep anger and heavy duty because he was still entirely terrified of offering her true and passionate love. She stated with absolute and final resolve that, unless he dared to completely surrender his frozen and heavily guarded heart, she absolutely wanted their highly dangerous covenant to end permanently. Julian stood perfectly and completely still, and her sharp and brilliant words struck his broad chest like a heavy and deadly physical blow. He opened his mouth to eagerly and desperately argue, but he possessed absolutely no truthful or brave words to successfully defend his cowardly and frozen soul. Elinor turned her elegant and proud back to the silent and completely stunned Duke. She walked quietly and gracefully toward her large wooden wardrobe, and she began to carefully and methodically pack her simple and faded dresses into a small and dark leather trunk. The heavy and highly profound silence in the ruined bedchamber was absolutely deafening and truly heartbreaking. Julian watched her pack her modest belongings, and he felt completely and utterly paralyzed by his own massive and ancient fears. He was the terrifying fortress of ice, and he possessed the immense power to easily destroy his terrible enemies. But he was completely and entirely powerless to simply speak the true and vulnerable words she so desperately needed to hear. The grandfather clock in the long hallway struck exactly 2 hours 00 minutes. The entire and massive stone castle was completely dark and highly silent, and the cruel and wealthy guests were finally and deeply asleep. It was the middle of July 1814, and the warm summer night felt incredibly cold and completely empty. Elinor finished packing her small and heavy trunk, and she put on her dark and warm traveling cloak. She walked quietly past the completely silent and frozen Duke, and she did not look back at his pale and handsome face. She left the grand and imposing Winterbourne castle. In the absolute dead of the cold night, she stepped bravely into the dark and lonely world, and she left Julian completely and entirely alone with his shattered and ruined fortress of ice. The powerful Duke finally realized with a crushing and terrible agony that he had successfully and perfectly protected his frozen heart, but he had completely and permanently lost the only brilliant and beautiful light in his entire dark and empty existence. The dark and heavy carriage rolled slowly across the uneven cobblestones of the grand courtyard. It was exactly 2 hours 30 minutes in the cold morning of July 1814. Eleanor Vance sat quietly on the soft velvet seat, and she felt a crushing and terrible agony deep within her lonely chest. She had bravely chosen to completely leave the imposing Winterbourne castle because she absolutely refused to live inside a golden and highly protected cage without true and passionate love. The massive wooden wheels turned loudly against the hard stones, and the dark night seemed completely endless and highly unforgiving. Suddenly, the fast and heavy sounds of running footsteps echoed loudly across the quiet courtyard. The carriage abruptly halted, and the sudden movement threw Eleanor slightly forward against the dark leather cushions. The heavy wooden door of the carriage opened smoothly, and the soft yellow light of a small lantern pierced the dark shadows. Lady Genevieve stood quietly outside the carriage, and the pale widow looked incredibly desperate and highly determined. The Dowager Duchess Agatha stood closely behind her, and the older and powerful woman lacked her usual and cruel aristocratic pride. Eleanor looked at the two women with wide and completely shocked eyes. Genevieve stepped slightly closer to the open carriage door, and she spoke with a voice that trembled heavily with deep and profound sorrow. She begged Eleanor to stay for just a single and quiet moment. Genevieve confessed honestly that she was the terrible and selfish because of the freezing ice surrounding the powerful Duke. She explained quietly that she had cruelly broken his trusting heart exactly 5 years ago. She stated firmly that Julian's coldness was absolutely not born of aristocratic pride, but it was born of profound and truly paralyzing fear. Genevieve told Eleanor deeply that the terrifying fortress of ice loved her with a completely blinding and fierce passion. She said that Julian was simply too terrified to properly and bravely speak the true and vulnerable words. The Dowager Duchess Agatha stepped forward slowly, and the imposing matriarch bowed her gray head with true and unexpected humility. The powerful woman spoke with a completely quiet and highly respectful tone. She told the poor and ruined widow that she had been entirely and terribly wrong. She confessed softly that she had foolishly valued empty aristocratic titles and shallow beauty over true and brilliant intellect. Agatha stated proudly that she had watched Eleanor bravely and flawlessly defend her innocent honor against the cruel and wicked baron. The older woman declared firmly that the vast and ancient Sinclair family desperately needed a strong and highly capable queen like Eleanor. She offered her profound and deeply sincere apologies, and she respectfully asked Eleanor to completely forgive her past and highly toxic behavior. Eleanor listened to their shocking and completely honest words, and her steady heart fluttered wildly and beautifully inside her tense chest. She felt a soft and warm wave of pure understanding completely wash over her weary soul. However, she knew perfectly well that Julian absolutely needed to speak the brave words himself. She politely thanked the two noble women for their kind and beautiful honesty, but she signaled for the tired driver to completely continue the dark and lonely journey. The heavy carriage rolled slowly forward once again, and it moved steadily toward the massive and towering iron gates of the grand estate. The carriage reached the heavy gates at exactly 3 hours 00 minutes. The dark and quiet path was suddenly and completely blocked by a massive and powerful black stallion. Julian Sinclair sat perfectly and rigidly upon the grand horse, and he looked exactly like a desperate and a deeply passionate warrior, completely fighting for his very soul. He did not wear his expensive velvet coat, and his crisp white shirt was completely open at his strong and muscular throat. He quickly and gracefully dismounted the dark beast, and he walked purposefully and heavily toward the stopped carriage. He pulled the heavy wooden door completely open, and he looked directly into the dark interior with his striking and intense silver eyes. He breathed heavily and rapidly, and his handsome face was completely stripped of all rigid and freezing aristocratic masks. He was entirely and completely bare before her observant and beautiful eyes. He reached out his large and warm hands, and he gently and desperately pulled Eleanor out of the dark carriage. They stood together on the cold and dusty ground, and the soft summer wind blew gently through his dark and messy hair. Julian spoke with a deep and truly resonant voice that completely shattered the quiet and heavy silence of the dark night. He told her fiercely and with absolute and raw passion that he had spent his entire adult life proudly believing that pure logic was his perfect and guiding lighthouse. He confessed completely that her brilliant and beautiful presence had utterly and permanently extinguished that cold and highly useless light. He stated deeply that he did not want to marry her out of heavy duty, and he absolutely did not want to marry her out of foolish pity. He looked directly into her dark and highly intelligent eyes, and he delivered his true and magnificent and completely vulnerable confession. He told her clearly that the massive and imposing Winterbourne Castle was absolutely nothing but a grand and incredibly splendid tomb without her bright and warm light. He admitted bravely that he was utterly and completely terrified of losing her, but he was significantly more terrified of living his entire vast life without her true and passionate love. He dropped to his strong knees on the hard and dusty ground, and he completely discarded every single ounce of his massive and highly arrogant ducal pride. He gently took her small and trembling hands into his warm grasp, and he looked up at her beautiful and pale face. He begged the brilliant and ruined widow to simply give him a single and true chance. He asked her softly and with profound and absolute devotion to please allow him the massive and ultimate honor of loving her with his entire and complete mortal existence. He promised faithfully that he would gladly completely destroy his thick and freezing fortress of ice just to properly and bravely hold her completely warm and beating heart. Eleanor looked down at the powerful and kneeling Duke, and she felt hot and happy tears completely fill her dark and observant eyes. The terrible and ancient curse of the frozen Sinclair heart was completely and permanently broken in that exact and beautiful moment. She slowly sank to her own knees on the cold dirt, and she wrapped her delicate and soft arms completely and tightly around his broad and highly muscular neck. She pressed her warm and trembling lips fiercely against his handsome and waiting mouth, and she answered his brave and perfect proposal with a deep and completely passionate kiss. Julian wrapped his strong and powerful arms securely around her slender waist, and he pulled her incredibly and tightly against his heavily beating chest. The dark and lonely night was instantly transformed into a bright and completely magnificent dawn of pure and absolute true love. They had completely survived the highly toxic and cruel aristocratic warfare, and they had successfully and beautifully forged true and unbreakable covenant of mutual respect and deep and overwhelming passion, the cold and freezing winds of winter blew softly across the high hills of Derbyshire in late December 1814. The massive and ancient stone walls of Winterbourne Castle were completely covered with bright and beautiful white snow. The grand and towering fortress looked exactly like a magical and highly peaceful wonderland. The entire and vast Sinclair estate was actively celebrating a completely real and deeply joyous royal wedding. The heavy and highly oppressive atmosphere of the dark and cruel summer was entirely and permanently gone. The massive crystal chandeliers burned brightly and beautifully inside the grand chapel, and the soft and sweet smell of fresh winter pine filled the warm and comfortable air. Eleanor Vance stood gracefully at the very beginning of the long and highly polished aisle. She wore a truly breathtaking and highly magnificent wedding gown of heavy white silk and delicate silver lace. She did not look like a poor and broken and completely pathetic widow anymore. She looked exactly like a true and radiant and highly powerful queen. She held a beautiful bouquet of rare and blooming white winter roses, and she walked slowly and proudly toward the grand and waiting altar. The wealthy and gathered aristocratic guests watched her elegant and completely flawless progress with deep and genuine respect. They had finally and completely realized that she was absolutely and undeniably the perfect and brilliant match for the powerful Duke. Julian Sinclair stood tall and incredibly proud at the end of the long aisle, and he wore his finest and highly decorated royal uniform. His striking and intense silver eyes were completely filled with pure and absolute and unhidden adoration. The thick and terrifying fortress of ice was completely and beautifully melted forever, and it was entirely replaced by a deeply warm and highly beating heart. He watched his beautiful and brilliant bride walk steadily toward his waiting and strong arms, and he felt a massive and profound sense of complete and ultimate peace wash completely over his weary soul. Eleanor reached the grand and ancient stone altar, and she placed her small and delicate hand safely and completely into his warm and secure grasp. The old and highly respected bishop spoke the sacred and beautiful wedding vows, but Julian and Eleanor only heard the quiet and steady beating of their own united hearts. They looked deeply and fearlessly into each other's eyes, and they promised to completely and faithfully love and protect each other for the rest of their long and magnificent lives. They shared a sweet and truly passionate kiss, and the gathered and happy crowd erupted into loud and highly joyful applause. The grand and formal winter wedding celebration lasted for 3 entire and completely wonderful days. The massive and beautiful Winterbourne Castle was completely filled with bright and warm light, and it echoed constantly with loud and happy laughter. Eleanor had successfully and brilliantly conquered the highly dangerous and cruel aristocratic world, and she had officially and proudly become the true and highly respected Duchess of Winterbourne. She stood quietly and peacefully on the high stone balcony on the very last and beautiful night of the grand celebration, and she watched the soft and white snow falling gently over their vast and quiet lands. Julian walked softly up behind her, and he wrapped his large and warm arms securely and tightly around her slender waist. He rested his handsome chin gently upon her soft shoulder, and they looked out over their thriving and completely peaceful territory together. The totally fake and strictly professional summer covenant had successfully and beautifully blossomed into a truly epic and highly enduring reality. The brilliant and strong shipping heiress and the brave and deeply loving Duke had completely and successfully defied every single strict rule of their highly restrictive society and they had ultimately and proudly won the most glorious and absolutely beautiful victory of all. The ancient and quiet stones of Winterbourne Castle would completely and forever stand as a massive and glorious testament to their true and highly magnificent and completely unbreakable love.